Today we're finishing up our study of the second chapter of the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of the Sabbath. Now, maybe that sounds a little bit old-fashioned for you, but Jesus is going to get into this with the religion police at the end of chapter 2. And I want to start with a really simple question to get us started here. What pleases God in your mind? Keeping the law on one side or loving people on the other side? And I don't want you to jump to conclusions here, because maybe most of you are going to be watching this thinking, well, you're going to say loving people is what pleases him. But the truth is that God is the one who created the law. So God's not against the law. He's just against the way we can sometimes distort the law, which is what the religion police are going to do in our story today. But make sure to listen to the very end of the video, because we're going to talk about how today's Christians can actually swing all the way to the other side and distort this concept of love. But let's start in the Old Testament, because it's important for us to understand where this concept of the Sabbath comes from. Exodus 20, verses 8 to 10. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. So that's one of the 10 commandments, and obviously it's kind of a big deal. And it's what provides some context for what is going to happen here as we turn to Mark chapter 2. In verse 23, it says, one Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees, the religion police, said to Jesus, look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath? Now, a quick little history lesson for all of you in the Old Testament. Like we just saw, God gave the commandment about the Sabbath, and there's just a little bit more that we can find in the Old Testament about it. But the Jewish nation, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, these kinds of people, over time, over the generations, over decades, they ended up adding all these rules and regulations and hundreds of specific examples of when you're breaking the Sabbath. And this is one of those situations. The Pharisees here aren't just really thinking about the commandment that God had given, kind of that big picture, zoomed out view of the Sabbath principle. They're thinking about all those thousands of little other rules and regulations that they put on top of it. But here's what always tends to happen with religion police, is they end up distorting the Old Testament law in the first place. Look, they're saying here that the disciples are harvesting grain, but they're really not. They're just breaking off heads of grain. And there's a difference. In fact, Deuteronomy 23:25 tells us about that difference. It says there, if you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. So technically, the letter of the law said it's okay to grab some grain, which is what the disciples were doing, but it's not okay to harvest the grain. So see, the religion police were distorting the law here to try to catch the disciples in a sin. But here's how Jesus responded to them. He said, haven't you ever read in the scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God during the days when Abiathar was the high priest and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. He also gave some to his companions. Now, you can find this story in the Old Testament, but I think it's interesting that Jesus goes not to that verse we just looked at. He could have done that, but Jesus uses an even more intense example. I mean, it's an example where David goes into the holy place, right? He's taking temple bread. And the point that Jesus is making is that nowhere in the Old Testament does it say what David did was wrong, even though technically he broke the Sabbath law. Even the Pharisees would understand that David was okay to do this, because even in the Old Testament, it never says that David was in the wrong. And here's the point to all of it. Jesus makes it clear in verse 27. Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. Jesus is saying here that God is not interested in just making up arbitrary rules for us to follow, but the rules that God makes for us are for our good. And so Jesus and his disciples, just like David and his companions, were following the spirit of the law, even though they technically weren't following the letter of the law. And the next story makes this principle even more obvious. And for this, we're going to start into Mark chapter 3. It says that Jesus went into the synagogue again and noticed a man with a deformed hand. Since it was the Sabbath, Jesus' enemies watched him closely. If he healed the man's hand, they planned to accuse him of working on the Sabbath. Now that's crazy, right? He's not just picking grain anymore. Now they're trying to catch him in this act of breaking the Sabbath law in order to heal a man. And I love what Jesus does here in verse 3. He said to the man with the deformed hand, "Come and stand in front of everyone." And then he turned to his critics and he asked, "Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing evil? Is this a day to save life or to destroy it?" But they wouldn't answer him. See, Jesus is just going to go toe-to-toe with these guys, and he wants to make sure that they understand how ridiculous their interpretation, really their distortion of the law is. So he brings them in front of everybody, like he wants to make this a teaching moment for everybody. And he catches them at their own game because they realized how stupid that they would look. They realized that by following the letter of the law, they were completely breaking the spirit of the law. And it says in verse 5 that Jesus looked around at them angrily. And not just with anger, but he was deeply saddened by their hard hearts. And so then he said to the man, "Hold out your hand." And the man held out his hand, and it was restored. And verse 6 says that at once the Pharisees went away and met with the supporters of Herod to plot how to kill Jesus. And so this story ends with Jesus showing the Pharisees that they were distorting the law. The law was good, but they were distorting it. They were missing the whole concept of love and the reason that God gave the law in the first place. But look, if you're talking about this in your small group, then probably you need to make sure to discuss the other end of the spectrum, because most of us in our churches today, we tend to not be caught up in legalism, but sometimes we swing it way too far to the other side. We don't distort the law. We distort love. You know, God tells us to love, but there are so many Christians, quote unquote Christians, who don't recognize that loving God sometimes means we have to tell people about his law. Sometimes it means we need to tell people about his word. Sometimes it means we need to call out sin in someone's life. And so as you finish up today, I want you to think about love versus legalism. And as you talk about this with your small group or your mentor this week, ask yourself the hard question: which one of those two do I distort?